panel of the day at the CPS Going for Growth conference. It's been a brilliant day so far, but we've saved the best till last. We have a fantastic panel to discuss the securing economic recovery for all, what lessons from the past can help inform a just response today. This is supported by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who are of course one of the country's most I'm going to say, well, sort of think tanks and advocacy groups, and do an awful lot of work in this area. And it's a really important one because, you know, we often talk about GDP as a headline figure, as getting, you know, just getting the growth rate up. But one of the problems in this country is that growth has not been shared very well. And this is something which tends to be exacerbated by recessions. Generally speaking, the people who already have assets, who already have secure jobs, tend to be the ones who do better when disaster hits, and then the rest of the country sort of slowly catches up. But even in the good years in Britain, it sometimes seems that you know, that to them that have, more has been given, and to them that don't, you know, less has. You know, the opposite has been true. You know, the Resolution Foundation has shown that the financial impact from COVID-19 comes after a decade of stalling improvements in living standards. And in the aftermath of the lockdown, you know, average household income fell by more than in the 2008 crisis. So we have some really severe questions, but I'm delighted that we have exactly the right people to answer them. Guy Opperman is Minister for Pensions and Financial Inclusion, and a CPS author. A far greater accolade than any mere ministerial title. Helen Barnard is the Acting Director of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Thank you very much both for being here and for supporting this panel. Dr. Gerard Lyons is both an eminent economist and one of the closest advisors to the current Prime Minister over the years. And hopefully joining us soon will be Rick Holden, one of the new wave of Conservative MPs in North West Durham. Each of the panelists will speak for a few minutes, and then we'll get a discussion going. Please, as ever, send in your questions either via the YouTube chat or via @CPS Think Tank, and I will try to either answer them specifically or bundle a few of them together to form a talking point. But Guy, let's start with you. How do we ensure a just and fair recovery that is spread around the country and around various groups?
So, thank you for asking me. Great honour and privilege to be helping Centre for Policy Studies again. I'd make a couple of key opening points. If you haven't read the amazing paper that Laura Farris and I wrote in November 2018 called All Hands on Deck, on productivity, on flexible working, on employee ownership, on the midlife MOT, and the variety of different ways in which you can genuinely make a difference to the issues that we're now confronting, then I would strongly recommend it. And it is still available in all good think tank bookshops, as they say. It is an effort by Laura and I, though, to make a serious and sustained 60-page study of the problems on productivity and to suggest key changes that we could do. And the pandemic, in my view, has actually brought forward one of the changes that we were really, really strongly behind, which was flexible working. And there is absolutely no doubt that the pandemic has caused a total change in the work practice of all of us. And if you're interested in levelling up, in my view, the flexible working and the pandemic have actually hastened the levelling up. Why? Because, so I'm speaking to you from rural Northumberland, 320 miles from London, and there is no doubt that traditional businesses would have to be based around the M25, would have to be much more London-based. And increasingly, I've just done a constituency day meeting a bunch of businesses. Increasingly, those businesses are locating themselves here, or if they were half and half, are much more going to be in Northumberland. And the consequence of that is people will say, why am I paying you know, several £100s a square feet in central London or M25 when I can get an office much cheaper, where the cost of living is lower, where schooling potentially is coming up and is as good, you can live and work in the countryside, and you can run a business on a cheaper basis to those who are based in the southeast. And I think the pandemic is going to really change the way in which business startups are, but people are going to be saying, I don't need to be based in central London. I don't need anything more than a satellite office there. And so I think the first thing is the pandemic is actually bringing forward the desire that I have, flexible working, and the impact of that, which I know will benefit County Durham, where Richard Holden is the Member of Parliament, or will benefit Northumberland, where we have more sheep than voters and we have lots of space for businesses. So I really feel that the pandemic will nudge that flexible working way, way further forward. The second, I can go through in more detail the points I make in the paper, but greater employee ownership. I think people are going to want to have a greater vested interest in the businesses they're working for. And I spoke at length about a policy I have at DWP as the Pensions Minister, which is the midlife MOT, which is an opportunity for those between the ages of 45 and 50 to reboot and relook at their life. And this is particularly going to be, I think, post-pandemic. And they're encouraged at the moment on a private sector basis. So Aviva, Hargreaves Lansdowne, several other businesses are doing this for all their employees, are looking at their wealth, their work, and their well-being, and then rebooting how those three are as an employee. It encourages fuller working lives, it encourages better mental health, it encourages flexible working, and I think it will make a big difference. I echo the thoughts of the previous speakers, Will Tanner and others today, that devolution is better. I spent yesterday as a minister with Dan Jarvis, who is the Metro Mayor in Yorkshire, and there is no doubt that the likes of he and Andy Street, and others to be fair, on a cross-party basis are driving this forward. And I think it is part of the government's agenda to have greater devolution. With greater power comes greater responsibility and greater accountability. And I hope we get more and better people putting themselves forward. It's a big deal that Andy Street is the Mayor of the West Midlands, because it's the first real private sector mayor we've had. And I hope that this will become something that people will be competing to do this job going forward. I'll finish on one final thing, and then my 5 minutes are up. I also think this pandemic will force us to look at future problems in a much more immediate way. Clearly, this country is doing a lot on climate change, and certainly in the portfolio, we have passed the sustainable pension regulations, called the ESG regulations, which are forcing us to look at how we invest with due account for climate change. I suspect the creation of a pandemic that some had prophesied may come, but we all hoped it wouldn't happen, will force us now to look as policymakers as a different approach to the things that we know are coming over the hill, of which climate change, its impact, the net zero by 2050, and the retrofitting of the UK economy will clearly be paramount. And I certainly, as a government minister, will be playing my part and believe that that is going to become ever more immediate, particularly with COP26 coming next year.
Guy, thank you so much. And I will just share on screen Guy's wonderful paper so that people can have a look can find it on the CPS website, cps.org.uk. It's called All Hands on Deck, How Businesses Can Help Handle Britain's Productivity Deficit. And now that the plugs are over, Helen, over to you.
Great. Hi, thanks everyone. So I think recessions do two things. One is they obviously bring a lot of immediate uncertainty and hardship, but the other thing is they bring long-term economic problems into sharp relief, and they bring an opportunity to find the right policy response that will set us on a different track. But we've also seen the wrong policy response will make those problems much worse. So I think if we look back at the last couple of recessions, there's a set of lessons we can take. So if you go back to the 1980s, we were obviously already in a process of economic restructuring, the decline of heavy industry and manufacturing. The recession in the 80s accelerated that, and it set in train that widening of both income and geographical inequality, which we're still dealing with. But crucially, what we saw was that whole communities were cut adrift during that process as the old jobs went, but we didn't have enough support in place to move the people onto the new jobs. I think if you then fast forward to the 2008 recession and the recovery, I think in the recession, what we saw was unemployment rising a lot more slowly, peaking at a lower rate than I think we'll see with this one. And that's partly because of the flexibility of our labour market. But crucially, the recovery post-2008, we focused in purely on quantity of jobs. We didn't look at all at the quality of jobs that were being created or at the pathways that people could follow. And what that led to was the decade we've just had, which has been a decade of stagnant pay, of poor productivity, and of rising in-work poverty. So employment rose, that was fantastic. People were drawn into the labour market who hadn't been there, but the quality of those jobs wasn't good. People were crowded into the bottom end of the labour market, where they're not just low paid, but also don't get a lot of training, don't get a lot of chances to progress. And that created vulnerabilities when the pandemic struck for individuals, but also nationally. What we've seen so far is the impact of COVID has then been heaviest on those low-income workers who were most vulnerable, both personally because of their financial instability and also because they're in more insecure work. We've also seen COVID impacting heavily on the places that had higher unemployment to begin with. And what we've done looking forward suggests the rest of the year, we're likely to see that continue. So low paid workers, 40% are at risk of unemployment, only 1% of higher paid workers. So we're likely to see that continue. Now, I think if you look at the policy response so far, we've seen some really bold, compassionate policies. So the job retention scheme, the strengthened social security, those two things have been an absolute lifeline for millions of people. They've kept people afloat, they've kept communities afloat. But I think what we all know is that the full scale of the economic impact is only just starting to become apparent. What we now need is the next stage of policy to be as bold and as compassionate so that we can limit the impact of the next wave of this storm and we can get a much stronger recovery. Because I think what's crucial is we need to get back to a growing productive economy after this crisis if we're going to be able to pay for the spending through the crisis, and also if we're going to be able to get living standards to a point that we would want for all of the people in our nation. So I think there's 4 things we need to do to get on that train. So the first is we've got to develop a new generation of good jobs. So bake in good quality jobs to all of our interventions, to all of the infrastructure spending and so on. The second is we've got to have a right to retrain. We've got to have a boost to adult education and skills. So we equip the people who are losing jobs and the people who are stuck in low paid jobs to get these new jobs. So the new jobs that are going to come from energy efficiency, from investing in infrastructure. The third thing is that we need to focus in on the weakest local economies. So we've just had a session just now on which ended with the idea of levelling up. I think that is even more important, that we have an ambitious plan for levelling up through the UK Prosperity Fund. And then the final thing is that we need to have more action to prevent long-term unemployment. So we've seen the Kickstart scheme focus in on young people, which is absolutely right. But there are other groups of workers who are at very high risk of losing their jobs, of being unemployed for a long time and of having that scarring effect. So what we now need is equivalent schemes for workers with low or no qualifications, for disabled workers, for people from some BAME groups who are going to be at high risk. And through that, we need to keep that social security lifeline strong, because that will let people stay afloat whilst the recovery kicks in, and it'll equip people to take all of these new opportunities, which, as Guy said, will hopefully be better spread out across the country. And we need all of our communities with people ready to grasp those. And that's one of the things that keeping the social security lifeline will help us do over the next year or so. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And yes, I mean, and obviously a very obvious point, but a very important one is that people who suffer during recessions don't just suffer during recessions, they suffer for the rest of their lives. You can see from 1980, you can see all the way through, if you have the bad luck to graduate during one of these cohorts, or not even to graduate, just to enter the labour market, it's really tough. So we'll now go to Gerard, and then I'm told Rick Holden is also going to be joining us, or even has joined us just now. So Gerard first, and then Rick.
Well, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure, great honour to be here, and thank you to the Centre for inviting me. What lessons from the past can help inform us about the future is the title of the session. Let me focus my opening comments in 3 areas. Broad context about the need for a pro-growth vision. Second, some specific lessons from the past. And third, what policies I think we need to implement about the future. First, a pro-growth agenda is the right one. Now, if we look in the past and look at the legacy of some of our previous chancellors, we had a Magdalene boom and bust, a Barber boom and bust, a Lawson boom and bust, a Brown boom and bust. Some of the other chancellors didn't even get to the boom phase. But if we look at the lessons from the past, it was very much about the need, I would say, if we look ahead, to avoid a dash for growth. In going for pro-growth policy, we need to be thinking longer term, strategically, and not rushing it. Also, one of the important lessons from the past is the need to avoid the danger of an imbalanced economy and an imbalanced recovery. Against that backdrop, I think the clear vision that needs to be outlined is a pro-growth strategy that combines all the key areas of policy. I would say that we need a three-arrowed approach. First, monetary and financial stability, including sound money. Second, a proactive fiscal policy. And third, the whole supply side agenda that needs to be there to incentivize the private sector and allow the public sector to play a very important supportive role, aimed at all the I's: investment, innovation, infrastructure, getting the incentives right, and in the process, reducing inequality. Second, are there specific lessons we can learn from the past? Let's just take a number of key lessons. First, after the Second World War, I think it's important to look back to then, because then we had a debt to GDP figure of around 260% or so, for obvious reasons. Currently, we have a debt to GDP ratio of just over 100%. That's leading some people to suggest tax increases are inevitable and necessary. Wrong. As we saw after the Second World War, the important thing was to have a pro-growth strategy, consistency between monetary and fiscal policy, and bring that debt to GDP ratio down steadily over time. The danger otherwise is that if we go for higher taxes, that limits growth potential, that adds to the problem on the fiscal side, and you become in a self-feeding downward cycle. Another important lesson from the past, particularly the early 80s. Unfortunately, unemployment looks set to rise, maybe significantly over the next year or so. In the early 80s, we had a big rise in unemployment. Now, Policy Exchange, where I'm a senior fellow, is doing some important work on this. And one of the key lessons is the need to keep the different elements of the unemployment safety net in place. Take the late 70s, early 80s. When I left school, in the upper sixth at school, my school, Carden Vaughan, it's the top ranked comprehensive school in London. Then, there and at other schools at that time, you basically had access to experts who knew the local employment situation. And this was true across the whole country. I don't get the impression that that's the case now. Schools are very incentivized to get people into the university system. We need to bring back one of those key positives from the education system then that was relevant for those going into work. A challenge though from the early 80s, when people were in unemployment for a long period of time, is that the whole claimant side, basically people received little support to move them out of long-term unemployment into jobs. Eventually the then government, I think, put around £1 billion into the Department of Works and Pensions. But we need to actually make sure that if, as seems to be the case, unemployment rises over the next year, we have that lesson from the 80s of the need to have skill, not just skills, but training and development to get people back into the labour force. And of course, another lesson is from the last recession we had, or last crisis after the global financial crisis. Then the focus was on austerity. We need to avoid that now. But what we saw in the aftermath of the global financial crisis was the importance and the impactfulness of unlimited monetary policy and unconventional monetary policy. We still have unconventional monetary policy now, but this crisis is also highlighting the need for an impactfulness of unconventional fiscal policy. So there are some of the broad lessons from the past to complete my second section. Third and finally, what should we be doing? As was mentioned in the last session, and as Helen touched on, we have a very imbalanced economy. Therefore, the levelling up agenda really is important. Place does matter. The immediate outlook in terms of policy should be to recognise that while some parts of the economy will rebound quickly, Other parts will not be able to return to normal for some time because of the vaccine gap and the need for social distancing. Furloughing should be extended to help those sectors whose business model will not be able to return to normal. At the same time, I think we should write off debt to small firms. Many small firms who, for instance, receive bounce back loans will be encumbered with high debt that will limit their ability to employ people. It will limit their ability to invest. It may be expensive, but debt forgiveness may be necessary. Another important lesson is to highlight that banks need to play a more proactive role than they're doing now. We still have the Macmillan gap. Banks are not providing enough money and lending to small, medium-sized firms. Also, as this crisis has shown, cash is on the way out. We need to therefore highlight and also speed up the need to bring banking services to the unbanked. So banks need to step up to the plate in terms of access to finance for small, medium-sized firms and in terms of unbanking or banking the unbanked. Other key areas of this, Helen touched again on the need for good jobs. I think that's key. We need to not only have a pro-growth strategy, but recognize that we need, ideally, and this will take time, to move from a low-wage, low-productive economy to a higher wage, higher productive economy. But within that, it's not just about jobs. If one looks at the key areas for people, particularly those on low incomes, it's about higher wages and actually where they spend their money. When I was at City Hall working for the then Mayor Boris Johnson, I championed the London living wage. I think higher living wages incentivize people back into the labour force, and contrary to what much of the theory suggests, they do not lead to higher unemployment as many people feared. However, one needs to be sensible about this because there are many challenges facing small firms at the moment, but higher living wages are part and parcel of this. But also, just to conclude, when we look at the areas that people spend their money on, housing and transport take a disproportionate amount of people's income, particularly the lower your income. Earlier today at the CPS conference, there was a focus on housing. Liam Hannigan and others talked about the need to bring competition into that housing sector to address that housing issue. We shouldn't be talking about house prices always going up being a good thing. We need to be talking about affordable housing for more people across the country, and likewise with transport, keeping the cost of that down. So at the end of the day, in terms of proactive policies, we need to set the template. The government needs a clear vision for the future. We need to learn some of the lessons from the past, and we need to actually look at it not only from the top down, but in terms of what it means in terms of jobs, wages, and where people have to spend their money. Thank you for your time.
Gerard, thank you very, very much. And I'm pleased that you've done my job for me in terms of my personal attempts to introduce the topic of housing to literally every think tank discussion I'm part of in a sort of delenda est Carthago kind of way, that if I bang on about it enough, we might eventually build some bloody houses. Rick, thank you for joining us. You are a new MP in one of the parts of the country that is probably going to be worst affected by the coronavirus shock. How do we ensure that the recovery is fair to your constituents as well as people with better, who are sort of who appear to be more resilient?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, first of all. And I'm sorry that if I end up repeating exactly what Guy said, then I'm sorry. But one of those things. Just picking up very briefly on what Helen said, I think that need for good jobs, absolutely essential. And then just picking up a little bit on what Gerard said, productivity is obviously key to that, because otherwise you can't pay good money. And if you want to build houses, you can come and build them in concert, because I've got a 400 acres left of a former steelworks site, which could do with some redevelopment. So bring them here. We're very happy to take them, but we do need the infrastructure to go with it. Bring the houses as long as you bring me a railway. More broadly, we cannot have what happened back in the 80s happening again up here. There are actually quite good signs that it isn't going to happen in the same way up here at all. We don't have those mass industries in the same way that we did. And I think one of the big lessons actually we do need to learn, and I think the government's actually probably doing it in quite a sensible way at the moment, is that what we did in difficult periods in the 60s and 70s is we bought off people and we gave them jobs which didn't really exist, and we propped up industries which should have become more productive over time and should have changed. We propped up the steelworks here in Consett for decades because nobody would make the political decision to close it or to actually lose any jobs there. We propped up the mining industry in large parts of it, and actually the key thing is with the furlough scheme, I'm glad it's sort of, I think it's been very important to support jobs at the really difficult part. But I want to see that cash in future not be there to necessarily save the jobs of the past, because there will be some jobs which are not coming back, but very much if there is money available to help create, to help companies up productivity, to help them take people on into jobs for the future. So I think that's one of the crucial lessons we actually need to learn, because Consett Steelworks closing, which is I'm actually tomorrow unveiling a plaque for the 40th anniversary of it, which is also the 40th anniversary of it closing, and it's an important moment, I think, for my community, because it actually just goes to show just how long ago that was. And what's replaced those jobs up here in County Durham is, and they have been replaced now. They weren't initially. We saw 35-40% rates of unemployment, and people hated the Conservative government back in the early 80s. But what's replaced them now is I have a large number of smaller companies, often set up by people back in the 70s and 80s, late 70s, very late 70s, and early to mid 80s. When the development funding came to this area, cheap land, government support, and that's, I think, that's exactly what we need. We need support for new businesses for the future, rather than to try and in any way prop up businesses or jobs which just aren't there anymore. I think one of the big bullet point for me from the talking points was, does the government have to choose between economic growth and levelling up, or can it do both? I think it can definitely do both. I want us to see, what I really need to see for areas like mine is just the opportunity for opportunities to be available, and a lot of that is transport. I have a huge number of people here who commute to jobs elsewhere. That's the real shift since the 80s, where everybody worked and where everybody lived in the villages, the pit villages of northwest Durham, or they lived in this little steel towns. Now everybody commutes. We don't have an infrastructure which was ever built to support commuting. I have no railway line in my constituency. I have no dual carriageway. I have no fixed public transport system at all. I do have some buses, but that's about it. And the really important thing for me is particularly if jobs do go, it's ensuring that there's access to them. That was one of the big systemic problems with unemployment we had here, is people not being able to get to jobs. They've got no money, they've got no car, they're used to getting on a bus. Then we've got to have that, the national bus strategy coming forwards later this year, I actually think is probably quite important. And Guy actually visited Crook Job Centre with me not that long ago, which is the part of my constituency which is probably most isolated in terms of transport. Crook and Weardale at the bottom of my constituency, and they are it's absolutely essential that they can get access to jobs and access to employment opportunities, because it is changing. Things are changing. The economy is not going to be the same as it was. So my big plea is, don't support the businesses, necessarily business of the past. Allow a bit of, and we need to allow some market forces to go through it a bit. But very much, if you can do anything to support new businesses starting up, particularly in green energy, I think there's a big opportunity down in Teesside for us on that. Then that's what I'm after. So thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And I think so. Actually, so I'm going to attempt, because there's quite a few people on the panel and quite a lot of questions already coming in. But most of the questions we're getting, and actually your answer sort of addressed one big kind of theme. So I'm going to try and ask sort of quite a rambling question incorporating quite a few different elements of it, which is about this idea of transition. So I think both Helen and Gerard have said very, one of the mistakes we made in the 80s was we didn't offer the safety net, we didn't offer the protection, we didn't help people through this transition. But obviously there is a tension between trying to rebuild what was lost, between protecting people, and between accepting that we are moving to something new. And the question is, if we're trying so A, where does that balance lie? And B, if we are trying to build that something new, how do we ensure that it is built in places like Concert and Redcar? How do we make sure that if businesses are being shouldn't we be telling, just to be provocative, shouldn't we be telling people in the famous phrasing, get on your bike? Shouldn't we be saying, look, this is where the opportunities are, so you should be moving to them, rather than trying to bring the opportunities to them? There's a whole sort of series of questions there, which I think hopefully we can talk about quite interestingly. Guy, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think you raised a lot of issues. I just want to push back on one thing that Helen said, that since the coalition there have been years of stagnant pay, and I think it is important both to set the record straight and secondly to frame the future. And the future is, we live in a country where the living wage, as we all know, was half what it is now. We're now at 8.72. So you've got a framework of productivity through wages, which is going to help us. We didn't have free childcare. We now have free childcare introduced under the coalition. You didn't have the tax threshold savings that introduced under the coalition that saves you, again, the average working family, hundreds and hundreds of pounds. And you didn't have automatic enrolment introduced in 2012, which gives you 8% savings on an ongoing basis. So I think those are the frameworks in which it's going to make it a lot easier. The second point, which I think is key, both lessons from the 80s, 90s, and to be fair, the noughties, and how it will help us now, and builds upon what Richard and I saw. We went to Crook Job Centre, and what I saw when I was in Dewsbury yesterday, and when I was with Dan Jarvis in Barnsley Job Centres, is universal credit. If there's one public policy that has thrived and proven itself during lockdown and during COVID, it is universal credit. The idea that we could have navigated 1 million people onto multiple benefit systems and ensured they got paid within a reasonably quick period of time is just for the birds. Everybody knows that is just not going to happen. Secondly, if we were on the old legacy benefit system, you would have the cliff edge. You'd have the 16-hour cliff edge. You'd have all the problems of trying to encourage people back to work that UC has fixed. Because under UC, quite clearly, you're in a position, you properly are mentored. You're not on some 13-week JSA roundabout that keeps going around and again. Secondly, you are able to have a complete online relationship with your work coach. And thirdly, your work can be graded as it goes up, so that if you 16 hours, you can still continue to receive some benefit, but also be earning. And I genuinely feel that the key tool to getting significant numbers of people off unemployment will be the nature of the benefit system and the way it helps people back into work. And a Department of Work and Pensions that is light years away from what it used to be. And I've been in job centres up and down the country, literally 2 yesterday. Richard and I were in Crook, and you could see the massive change and the great work that they are doing, getting people back into employment. I would also make a couple of things, which is Kickstart is only recently launched. I think it will be groundbreaking. I really do. I met it's actually one of Richard's constituents who runs a business called Fireplace. And they've signed up for 90 people already on Kickstart, and that's just one business. And there are going to be a significant number of people who see this as an opportunity to train up young men and women and navigate them back through. I could talk to you about, the need for UTCs. Technical colleges quite clearly are going to be vital going forward. I've got one just opened in the Northeast. It's taken us a long time to get it. I think it'll be game changing. I could talk about greater devolution. I'm certain that is the way ahead as well. The Holy Grail is, of course, integrated government, trying to ensure that local services, national services are integrated and driving forward real change. And I'll just answer one point of Gerard's point in respect of banking the unbanked. Obviously, there is the basic bank account to assist those who are in difficulties going forward. But if you don't have that right sort of bank, do as I did. So I was chairman of the creator of the Northumberland Community Bank, which is the fastest growing bank in the Northeast. And it does exactly that. It is a beefed up credit union that provides access to finance, savings and loans. And in the longer term, it can do an awful lot more, which is now an online bank as well, which is competing with the big boys here locally and genuinely making a difference.
Thanks, Guy. And can I just do a quick moment of lobbying, which is there is still, however, a cliff edge in the welfare system when it comes to support for mortgage interest, which the CPS and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation will be doing some work on putting out some work on very, very soon.
I look forward to what the Chancellor's going to say to you about that.
Well, Helen.
Yes, so I'm going to start with your question actually, which is about transition. And I think you're right. So I don't think that what we want to do is look at the pre-COVID economy, and the exam question isn't how do we rebuild it exactly the way it used to be, because there's loads of stuff that wasn't particularly good, and as well it's a bit pointless. I think the key has to be there's going to be transitions. We need to equip people to thrive through those transitions, and that's what we haven't done very well in the past. And so that's why we need things like a real New Deal for adult education. And I think and we need to equip places. So I think your question, should people get on their bikes? I think I'll flip it over and say, do we really think it is right that there should be any part of the country where there aren't decent quality jobs? And I don't think any of us would want that. So I think the exam question is, how do you make sure in every bit of the country there are decent jobs, people who are trained to do them, and buses that will get them to those jobs quickly? If you can get those things in place in every place, then I think you've got a winning combination for the economy as a whole. On some of the other things, so the interesting thing, so the story about pay is a story of two halves, isn't it? So on the one hand, you've got average pay, average weekly earnings of an employee in the UK fell about 3% in real terms between 2010 and 2018. So overall, we've had a decade of stagnant pay. But as Guy has said, what we've had is a fantastic policy which has boosted pay at the bottom. So the national living wage is a brilliant achievement. I think, it has made a big difference. By itself, it doesn't free workers from poverty, from getting into debt, from not being able to cover their costs, because of the other things we haven't done. And so going to make Robert happy by saying housing. One of the things we didn't do post the last recession, so we did put money into housing. We didn't put money into it in a way that made it more affordable for people at the bottom. And that's something I think we've got a real opportunity to change at the moment. I think the other thing is in work, what we saw is although hourly pay at the bottom was going up, there was also an increase in insecure jobs and a massive lack of progression. If you're doing a national living wage job and it's just you and you're at the beginning of your career, that's fine. If you're still there 15 years later trying to support a family on the same low pay without having had any training or progression, that's not fine. And it's those people who are stuck in poverty. And it's those people we need to make sure you can actually progress. So we need all these new jobs, green jobs, to have career paths. So you get in at the bottom, you get trained, you move up. And so that kind of what Gerald was saying about the shift to a style, to use things like business support to help and nudge businesses to create better quality, secure jobs. We've got some levers there we can use. And I think we need to make sure we use those through the recovery so that the rebuilt economy is one that lets you get a decent quality job, a house you can afford, in a place where you can get to it.
And just quickly, would you echo Guy's comment on universal credit? It's striking that there's been a lot of attention on the bits of government which did fall over, but furlough, like blessedly, the furlough, the tax and benefits, and the bit which involves money going into people's bank accounts seems to have coped really quite well.
Yeah, I mean the job retention scheme. I think whichever team in the Treasury and HMRC who did that should be given medals, because that's been done incredibly well and fast. Universal credit is really interesting. So yes, I agree, it has stood up amazingly well to the degree of demand. I think it has, though, continued to pinpoint why some of the problems are problems. So particularly the 5-week wait at the beginning seems a particularly strange thing to have in a situation where people are overnight being plunged into difficult situations. So I think hopefully coming out of it, it will give added impetus to say some of these design flaws, they're fixable, and we should fix them. But overall, yeah, I mean, I think it has stood up very well. And there's obviously lots of people throughout job centres have been working night and day to make it work. So I think good on all of them.
I'm slightly alarmed that a degree of consensus is breaking out. So hopefully Richard or Javid is going to storm in and object to everything that's just been said.
Well, let me go. I'll leave Richard to do all the disagreeing, baby. I think I'm going to agree in many respects. The question was about transition. First, I think it's important to stress, in my view, that now's not the time to be pessimistic about either the UK or the global economy. There's phenomenal monetary stimulus and phenomenal fiscal stimulus in the pipeline, both here and globally. Indeed, some other countries have even been more generous than the UK has been. My comment about the furlough scheme, because I'm not sure if Richard was referring to that. Richard made a comment about he didn't want the furlough scheme to keep old jobs in place. And that's valid, but I think it's important to stress that the nature of this crisis is that with a vaccine gap, some sectors that are vitally important, the arts is the key one, arts creative sector, cannot return to normal because of necessary social distancing. So I think extending the furlough scheme needs to be to help those viable, thriving sectors of the economy, which through no fault of their own have been temporarily sidelined, shall we say, because of this COVID-19 virus. So I think the first key thing in terms of the transition is to get the economy back to strong growth. Then we need to actually recognize we need to raise that trend rate of growth. It's only a few years ago that economists were talking about the UK's trend rate of growth being around 2%. Now the guesstimate is somewhere around 1.3, 1.4%. That suddenly makes some people more pessimistic about the longer term fiscal outlook. We need to raise the trend rate of growth, which we can do through the right policies that I think many of us have touched on earlier. The other part of the transition is linked into the imbalanced nature of the economy. We have imbalances in many respects. London versus the rest is one aspect, urban, rural, coastal, inland. Coastal areas are often the areas that are very cold, where once you're there, you find it difficult to break out of. I would say the key thing is not to come back to your point, Richard, about getting on your bike. Naturally, if people want to move, let them move. If people want to be attracted by the magnetic pull of London or wherever else it is, let them go there. What I think the public sector has to do is to provide the right framework. And that means a focus on infrastructure and also incentives. Getting the incentives right is key. Regardless of wherever you're on the political spectrum, incentives really matter. I thought Richard really touched on a very important point well in terms of transport. I remember going up to Durham in 1982, 83, because a friend from uni was married, and it was very difficult to get to then. I'm horrified if he's telling me that the transport links still haven't improved 35 years later. And what we found even in London was once you put down transport links, the Jubilee line extension is a classic one. The Treasury was against extending the Jubilee line to the Docklands. Why would anyone want to go to the Docklands was almost their thinking. Cost benefit analysis hasn't always worked in the past when we've decided on these infrastructure projects. But now at a time when the government can borrow for practically next to nothing, or indeed at certain times has been paid to borrow in the last few months, we should be taking advantage of the need to put down transport links and incentivizing the private sector. So transport really does matter, infrastructure does matter. And just a final point, tying education locally into local economies also matters as well, particularly with a point to vocational training. So there's lots of things that the government can do without imposing itself too much, but in the way in which it incentivizes the private sector to almost lead the recovery and transition us to hopefully a higher future rate of growth as well.
Rick, do you want to come in, or should I move to the next question?
I'll just come in very briefly. This transport thing. I am sort of on the same line as most people. I agree on the I agree on the sector furlough thing. I get that bit. Asset furlough potentially for coaches, major issue for some of my small businesses here, and there's other things like that. But what I'm saying is, let's not do it across the entire piece. There are some. There's a lot of stuff which has changed due to coronavirus, and we're not helping anybody by keeping them essentially trapped in a job which isn't going to return. Maybe not quite get on your bike, but get on the bus. I want some buses, But let's go to the next.
Right, and so again, because I think this is probably going to be the last round of questions we have time for, I'm going to pull together two different ones, which actually ties into what Gerard was just saying. But so a key part of the levelling up and the problems with the economy and the problems with pay is skills. So at the start of this Parliament, back before the recent unfortunate events, the government sort of did a big exercise to work out what levelling up meant, because it was there in the manifesto, and they thought they should probably kind of work it out. And I am told that the Treasury essentially concluded that the problem was skills, that, as was alluded to actually by Will Tanner in our last panel, that we have a very substantial number of people in the workforce who have not had, as was just alluded to now, who have not really had any training, who do not have great literacy, do not have great numeracy. And even if you fix schools, those people are still in the workforce and will be for the next sort of 20 or 30 years. So if we want to, deliver this high wage, high productivity economy, what can we do about the people who exist already in the workforce and level them up? And then bringing in a couple of questions that we've had. How should we be giving greater freedoms to local? Rick, you used to be an education special advisor. You might have a view on this. Should we be giving greater freedoms to local areas to develop their own education, locally appropriate education? And should local employers be given more of a role to ensure that people are learning things that will be useful for them? So, well, Rick, if you want to start on that, otherwise whoever wants to go.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. So, no, I was an education department SPAD, and I've actually got a very, very good, exactly what the question was about there, but a very good college in my constituency called Derwentside College, who are fantastic at working with local employers and actually design some of their courses around specific jobs at local firms as well, have a phenomenally high rate of getting people into work. I think one of the biggest issues I've seen in the last few years when I was an education SPAD, this has really rammed home to me, is that a lot of the local colleges, which did particularly that level 4 and 5, which is basically HNCs, HNDs, so post A-level / BTEC, but sub-degree level courses. A lot of those, particularly by colleges around the UK, they've been really hammered by actually the expansion of the university sector. I remember being over in Cumbria at Kendal College with Secretary of State, and them telling us that they'd seen these level 4 and 5 qualifications were designed working with local firms, local colleges, and their numbers of students doing them had halved in the last few years because the university sector at the bottom end had basically come along and said, look, come to university somewhere else, do a degree in whatever, and you want the full university experience, etc., etc. And they'd started to see students who had left them at 18, who would have been far better for them, for the local economy, for productivity, etc., to have done a level 4 or 5 or even a level 6 course locally, but had then left the area, got themselves in a lot of notional debt, cost the taxpayer an absolute fortune, done a degree which didn't actually help them anyway, moved back to the area, and then was having to go back and do those courses, which they should have done in the first place, all over again. So I think we just need to be, when we're thinking about this, we have to think about further education and higher education in the round as a, what are we going to do for people post 18, basically. And I think one of the comments about adult learning, I think from you, Helen, and how we need to do some of that and allow some of that sort of more lifelong learning, upskilling, leveling up. It's definitely got to be a thing for people throughout it's going to be a personal thing as well. I know that the biggest thing that most that could really improve people's lives in my community would be, the girl I went to school with who's got 2 kids, who's earning, 25,000 a year as a supervisor at a supermarket, and if, maybe she's been in post for a while, so she's on reasonably good money. If she can get that, if she could do a course which enabled her to move to that next level, which means she could manage the bloody shop, and she could earn 35, 40,000, 50,000, that would be a huge change, massive change for her and that family. If there's anything we can do to enable that individuals to level up skills, training, education, then I think that's important. But as I said, before, access to jobs. I don't think it's fair to make people. Look, I'm not saying that we want. We should be ensuring that there's a City of London everywhere, or anything like that. But if we respect those places as on a political side, which we've just been elected in, and we respect those people, they expect us to deliver for them on a manifesto, a Conservative manifesto promise to level up those communities as well. With the I'm not against them getting on a bike or on a bus to go to Darlington or Durham or Newcastle, but we're not gonna. I'm not gonna say let these places fall.
Can I? So I want to say I think you're right. Skills has got to be at the centre, and it's got to happen both on the business side and through the public sector. So I think one of the things we need to do is incentivize businesses to invest in low-skilled workers, because that's something that you don't tend to get from most low-paid, low-skilled workers. So we've done work with Will Tanner around an in-work training tax credit to try and pull businesses to do that. And the other thing I think is investing in using business support to improve management quality. So when we've looked at why our productivity lags behind other countries, one of the big problems is that our management isn't very good, so that people's skills aren't well used. So I think we need to try and get businesses to do more. But I think you're right, we need to do much better on the public side and actually bringing together funding streams. So I think we need to bring together, you've got the adult education fund budget, you've got the National Skill Fund, you've got the National Retraining Scheme. We need to just put all 3 together into a single funding stream, set a national framework, and then devolve it down to mayoral combined authorities to use it in their areas to boost skills. And I'd say just the third thing is where we're doing these big infrastructure spending, every project should have an attached package of skills and employment support to skill up local people and get them the employment support to get those jobs. Otherwise, you'll end up with lots of great new buildings and railways, but the local people won't have actually got the jobs. So I think if we did those 3 things, we could come out massively stronger from all this.
Hi, Gerard.
Sure, I'll come in if you like. So,
very, very quickly, but
sure. I've just got to correct Helen that there is no 5-week wait on UC. As we all know, you can get your money on day 1. But as to the arguments, the Augur review on lifelong learning and the certificate that you could get for a long-term employment on a long-term basis that you could dip in, dip out of, I think is something that government really should look at. And I know that Gavin Williamson has done a lot of work doing great stuff on FE. I think we should do rocket boosters to academies and free schools. The change that has happened. So when I went to, in 2010, when I went to Michael Gove's office, there was a desert. And that desert was the Northeast, with no academies whatsoever in the northeast of England. It is slowly but surely being transformed. And I visited an academy school today and I met the head teacher, and they are transforming education in some of my communities, no question. and they are really driving the pupils forwards. They're doing Singapore maths, they're doing phonics, they're doing mental maths, they're testing pretty much every week. I asked a kid a while back at this school, do you mind being tested? And various, as we all know, certain parents are really upset if their children are tested. And the child, who was about 8, turned to me and said, how do I know if I'm getting better if I'm not tested? And they're being tested every single week in that school. I just got to drive forward education change. I would also, make a huge point about the change in older workers. So the midlife MOT that I talked about in the outstanding paper with Laura Farris, all hands on deck for the Centre for Policy Studies, talks at great length about the midlife MOT, which forces businesses to say to their employees, we've got this muscle memory, you've got this ability, but we accept you're not going to be doing the same job at 45 that you will probably be doing at 65. How do we retrain you, reboot you, and give you the opportunity, both for flexible working and retraining, so that we get all that benefit of all your lifelong experience and keep you working until 65 or retirement age?
Gerard,
Yeah, well, very quickly. Look, there's lots of very good work that's been done in the UK on this whole area of skills and training, many think tanks, including yourselves. It's about executing what's already there. But the points already made, in-work training for low-skilled workers is a key issue. That's been pointed out. Ian Duncan-Smith, for instance, recently was writing a few pieces on this. Second, the key thing about universities. Unfortunately, we have too many people coming out who are underemployed or overqualified. That reinforces the need for a focus on vocational training, other aspects like that. The online and lifetime learning aspects that people have talked about is very important. But at the end of the day, it's important to stress that while we talk about this virus likely to change many things, some of the key features that were in place before this virus will be embedded in the future. In particular, the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence. And that's going to create lots of new jobs as well as displace some existing jobs. So what the government has to do is again put down the incentives for more of the future success to be spread across the country. A key challenge for many parts of the country is that you lose your skilled workers, your young, ambitious people down to London. We don't want to hold back London, we want to bring up other parts of the country. So infrastructure, housing, transport links, all of these matter, as well as incentivizing firms to want to actually be based outside the southeast. So all the things that have been talked about just need to be executed. It's execution of the policy that I think becomes key in the future.
But private sector, if I can come in, private sector will move to the north, to Durham and to Northumberland because of, not just because they want to level up, but they'll do so because they absolutely need to, because it's not economic anymore to stay in London and M25 in the southeast. When you have flexible working, when you can do remote working, when you can work off broadband. And I think that the pandemic is actually going to cause the levelling up change to be accelerated by reason of private sector saying, why am I paying several £100s a square foot in down in South when I can be in obviously the second best constituency with Northwest Durham or the best constituency of Hexham and Northumberland?
Yeah, you're right.
I pay £4 a square foot a year.
Yeah.
In concept, £4 a square foot a year.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much for that. We are now out of time. Helen has to give her computer back to her children. I have to answer the repeated phone calls from my mother, which have been going on in the last few minutes. And Guy and Rick have to go to a mysterious address by the Prime Minister, during which he will no doubt outline the latest stage of the levelling up agenda. But I am comforted that as a result of this conversation, when people look back on the recovery from the coronavirus, unlike the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s, they will say they made no mistakes at all and did everything absolutely right. Thank you all very much for being here with us for this particular panel. Thank you to everyone who's been here throughout the day. We hope you enjoyed it, and please follow CPS Think Tank on Twitter, sign up for our newsletter, and do everything to keep yourselves informed of all our policy work. And thank you again to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for supporting this particular panel, and to Lloyds Bank and the City of London for supporting our earlier panels. Goodbye and have a very nice evening. Thank you.